Annenberg Media.
All economic activity has its environmental cost. Who should make the rules? Who should pay the price to keep the environment clean? Does trade among nations harm or help the environment? The environment, what are the trade-offs? We'll find out when we look inside the global economy.
Hello, this is Annenberg. In this segment of Inside the Global Economy, we're going to be talking about the environment. What happens when pollution crosses national boundaries? Do industrial countries have the right to impose their environmental standards on poorer countries? And are the goals of free trade on the one hand and environmental protection on the other hand diametrically opposed? We'll answer some of these questions by looking at two case studies, one in Mexico, the other in Western Europe. We'll also hear from a panel of experts about their views on some of these issues. Now, the environment could be the subject of an entire series in and of its own. However, today we're going to focus on some introductory thoughts and analyses on the environment and environmental issues, and then look at some of the international ramifications of it. First of all, it's important to point out that for economists, pollution is a classic case of market failure. Now, economists don't always believe markets work efficiently. In fact, there are a number of cases where markets do not work well and they fail, and pollution is one of them. And the reason is that in the case of pollution, you get a divergence between social costs and private costs. What do we mean by this? Let's say there's a factory polluting and it dumps waste into a river. The people downstream from that factory will suffer the cost of that pollution. And unless that factory is forced to pay for those costs or to reduce the pollution, the factory will just continue to pollute. So there's a divergence between the cost to the factory and the cost to society as a whole. Another example is our use of air and water and forests. We tend to overuse them because, in effect, they're free. And so we tend to pollute in various ways, whether it's water or air, if we're using a barbecue or have a fire in our fireplace, we tend to pollute, in effect. And unless we're forced to pay for that, again, we don't suffer the cost, but society as a whole does in terms of increased pollution. So again, there's a divergence between individual costs and social costs. There's a similar analogy in terms of global costs versus domestic costs. Let's look at an example here of a factory in France that dumps into a river that then flows on into Germany. Again, the Germans bear the cost of the French pollution, so you get a divergence here between the French costs, which are low, relatively speaking, on pollution, and the German costs that are relatively high because they suffer the consequences. So again, there's a divergence. Another example is global warming, where each country is basically polluting, burning carbon fuels of various kinds, and the globe as a whole suffers. So again, each country doesn't bear the costs of global warming, but the globe as a whole does. So this gives us a sense of where the problem lies. And we can amplify some of these points by looking at it graphically. This shows supply and demand with and without the incorporation of pollution costs. We've got on the horizontal axis quantity, on the vertical axis price and costs. The demand curve slopes from the top left to the bottom right, and it basically shows that as the price or the cost of a particular product decline, the demand increases. The supply curve without the incorporation of pollution costs is the lower of the two supply curves. They're the ones that slope from the bottom left to the top right. And if you incorporate the pollution costs, if you explicitly take into account the pollution costs, then the costs are higher and that supply curve shifts upward. Now let's look at the impact here in terms of the actual market and the quantity produced especially. If the full costs of the pollution are not incorporated into the costs of producing that good, and the cost at which that good is sold, incidentally, then there's a tendency to overproduce that product. So we see Q1, that is the quantity produced, in equilibrium when the full costs of pollution are not incorporated in the price. It shows this sense of this overproduction. However, if we incorporate the full costs of the pollution, if we in fact have the price of that good reflect as well the social costs of the pollution, then we notice that as the supply curve shifts upward, the quantity goes from Q1 to Q2. It moves backward. There's less produced. So what we're saying is when you fully reflect the pollution costs in the price of a product, then there is not this tendency to overproduce. Now, how do you do this? How does a policymaker bring this about? Well, one possibility is to impose a pollution tax, either in terms of air pollution or water pollution or what have you. And in fact, many attempts have been made to do this, some of them quite successful. So what you could do is in effect, put a tax on every unit produced of that particular product. It could be paper, if it's a paper mill that's dumping into a river. And that additional price will then be reflected in the price of the good. So that's one way to go about it. Another kind of policy that governments can enact is something referred to as command and control. That is where they set quantity limits on the amount of production and pollution. Now, this does have often the result of reducing production and reducing pollution. However, from an economic perspective, it tends to be inefficient because governments are not the best agents for determining exactly what's the right amount of production and exactly what's the right amount of pollution. Economists much prefer the option of imposing a tax and let the markets then decide what is the best, what is the optimal amount of production and pollution as a result. A similar analysis can be done for the divergence between domestic costs and global costs of pollution. We have basically the same graph here where the lower supply curve reflects the domestic costs of pollution, whereas the higher graph reflects the global costs. Here again, to use the example that we'd used before, let's say there's a factory in France that's dumping into a river that flows into Germany. If you just look at the French costs, that's the lower of these two supply curves. But if you incorporate the cost to Germany of that additional pollution, then it's the higher supply curve that incorporates the cost to Germany. But the dilemma here, when you've got transnational pollution, is how does a country like Germany put a tax on the pollution in France? So that obviously adds a whole new dimension of international policy. And a lot of discussions have been going on, treaties among countries, attempts to, let's say, impose a global carbon tax has been suggested to reduce emissions and so forth. So it is very much an active discussion right now about how do countries get together to account for some of these international dimensions of pollution. Let's see if we can summarize some of the policy options available for pollution control. We've discussed a couple of them already. The first is a pollution tax. Now, economists like this because it's very efficient. It lets the markets function. The second are physical limits on pollution. This is referred to as command and control, as we said earlier. Economists tend not to like this because it basically asks the government to decide what's the optimal amount of production and pollution for a country, and governments tend not to be very good at those kinds of decisions. Markets are much more efficient at determining that. A third option, which is a very creative option, is to set physical limits, but let companies trade those physical limits. I'll give you an example. Recently, U.S. companies were allowed to trade their permits on sulfur dioxide emissions. These are U.S. utilities, U.S. electric companies, and gas utilities and so forth. And what they did was, what it allows them to do was, let's say, utility A, which pollutes less than its permit, can then trade that additional incremental permit to utility B that's polluting more than its allowed permit. And what this does is it allows the market to decide what's the optimal, if you will, amount of pollution for a company and for an industry, and it allows the market to function. So it's a creative way of achieving an overall goal, but let the market then decide what the distribution is of the pollution allowances, basically. A fourth option is to subsidize pollution control equipment. And again, the idea here is that if you subsidize it, companies will buy pollution control equipment more readily, therefore they will use it, therefore pollution will go down. The problem here is, while the idea is not a bad one, the reality is that often the subsidies will bet on a wrong technology or an outdated technology or an inappropriate technology. And so it's not a very efficient way of achieving the goal. The fifth option is a particularly interesting one that has received a lot of attention among economists recently, and that's the notion of assigning property rights. The basic premise here is that one of the problems about pollution is nobody has the property rights. For example, if you have a factory polluting and it goes downriver, basically, nobody has the property rights to that river, so therefore nobody, in effect, can charge for the cost of cleanup and the pollution. So without property rights, there's a tendency to overuse a particular resource. And recently, around the world, a number of creative attempts have been made to use this idea. For example, in Indonesia, slum dwellers, squatters, were given the rights to the pieces of land that they're squatting on. And immediately what happened is, because they now had those property rights, they took pride in that property, they cleaned it up, they invested in sanitation and so forth. So in fact, it became much cleaner. Similarly, in Kenya, many farmers were given the property rights to the land that they were farming. And again, it became in their interest to try to reduce the soil erosion, because now it was their land. And the third example is in New Zealand, where fishermen were given property rights to certain areas of water for fishing. And again, what happened was because it was theirs now, there was less overfishing going on. Whereas before, when nobody had the property rights, it was in effect a free good, and there was a lot of overfishing going on. So again, a very, very creative, interesting approach to the pollution problem. This brings us to another analytical tool that economists use, and it's a controversial one, but it suggests that, in fact, there may be a point beyond which pollution control is not cost effective. And let's look at this. What we've got here are the incremental benefits and incremental costs of pollution control. And what's said is, initially, the incremental benefits of pollution control far outweigh the incremental costs, and so it's very effective. But as time goes on, the incremental benefits begin to decrease and the incremental costs begin to increase. So at some point, you want to stop at the point where the incremental benefits and the incremental costs are the same. Beyond that, when the incremental costs are higher than the incremental benefits, then it's in effect not cost effective to do further pollution control. Now, what do we mean by costs and benefits? The costs are easier to identify. The cost basically can be a pollution tax, or it can be the cost of doing the actual cleanup, or buying a scrubber for a smokestack, or what have you. So the cost side is easier to identify. Benefits are a little harder to measure, but again, fairly understandable. This could be lower incidence of deaths, for example, from certain kinds of pollution, lower incidence of disease, let's say lung disease, because of air pollution, or it could be just increased enjoyment of certain environmental assets that we have. Again, hard to measure, but the idea is basically a good one. Now, again, to go back, if we look at the green shaded area here at the left on this graph, what it says is, in the early phases of pollution control policies, when you're enacting things like property rights, as we talked about earlier, or if you're removing subsidies to energy use, which many countries have had and still do, which encourages energy use. When you remove those, these are fairly low-cost kinds of options to pursue, and the payoff is fairly large. In the next phase, in this sort of blue area in the middle, you can do things like investment in new technologies and so forth, and again, fairly large payoff. And then the last set of policies in the orange area, furthest to the right, are things like pollution taxes, various kinds of regulations that really bring us to the point where we want to be. Again, in principle, it's a very good idea. In practice, it's hard to decide exactly at what point one should stop doing additional pollution control. But again, the principle is a very important one, because some people have suggested we want to eliminate pollution completely. Well, that's very, very costly to society. and most of us would probably balk at the cost. But there is a balance here, and there is a sort of a point where the social costs and the social benefits match, and that's the general principle behind this graphic. Now let's switch gears now and start to talk about the international ramifications of the environment, and specifically start to address the question, are the goals of free trade and environmental protection contradictory? To begin to answer that question, we'll look at our first case study, which looks at Mexico and tuna fishing.
Delphinus delphis, the true dolphin. The United States passed laws to save the dolphins, but Mexico complained that saving the dolphin would cost jobs in the tuna industry. What happened when the Save the Dolphins movement took on the tuna industry? How much will we pay for environmental protection? In the eastern tropical Pacific, fishermen find tuna by looking for dolphins, surface swimming dolphins that travel above schools of tuna. As shown in this video provided by the Earth Island Institute, a net drawn around the dolphins catches the tuna and the dolphins, many of whom die before they can escape. To the San Francisco-based Earth Island Institute, saving the dolphin was a matter of environmental and moral consciousness. David Phillips, president of the Earth Island Institute.
Whether it was because of a generation growing up on Flipper, or whether or not it was just the emotional bond between people and what are considered to be very intelligent social animals that have never done any wrong to mankind, people wanted to see marine mammals protected.
But across the border in Mexico, in the port city of Ensenada, saving the dolphins meant losing business and jobs. Felipe Charot, owner of a Mexican tuna fleet.
In order to survive economically, we must fish on tuna that has a value, and we must catch it in enough volume to justify the fishing trip. To do so, we must fish on adult tunas, and those are associated with dolphins.
Tuna companies responded with dolphin-safe tuna labels to steer concerned shoppers to tuna caught without setting nets on dolphins. But the force of the marketplace, said environmentalists, wasn't enough. They needed the force of law.
And the only reforms that have ever been made have been under pressure from U.S. embargoes, lawsuits, etc.
Mexican tuna boats in international waters were beyond the reach of the U.S. dolphin protection law. But tuna exported by Mexico into the U.S. was subject to U.S. law. And in 1990, the U.S. slapped an embargo on Mexican tuna. Mexico complained to the Switzerland-based General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT for short, the multinational agency that sets rules for international trade. The U.S. embargo, Mexico argued, violated GATT policies against restricting trade through unilateral and discriminatory action. Carlos Camacho Gaos, Undersecretary of the Mexican Fisheries Ministry.
Application of the law or the implementation of the law is completely against free trade, is completely without scientific basis. It is not agreed among different countries. It's unilateral, therefore, and the application of the law only goes for one part of the world, which happens to be the area in which our vessels, the Mexican Economic Zone, is. That's the way you use ecological tools nowadays in order to be a little bit protectionist.
But the U.S. denied that the tuna embargo was discriminating against Mexico or violating the most favored nation principle of non-discriminatory trade rules. U.S. Ambassador to GATT, Rufus Yerxa.
And we argued here that even though we were embargoing certain countries and not embargoing others, we were embargoing based on certain objective criteria, and that we subjected all countries to the same objective criteria.
Before 1991 was out, the GATT panel reported its preliminary decision in favor of Mexico and upholding GATT's prohibition of trade rules that exclude imports because of how they're produced. Richard Eglin, director of GATT's Trade and Environment Section.
The United States, by putting an embargo only on imports from Mexico, I think it covered also Venezuela and Vanuatu, but in any event, not all GATT member countries, was in breach of the rule of non-discrimination.
The U.S. embargo, said GATT, hurt not only the tuna industry, but the ultimate beneficiary of free trade, the consumer.
Hello. International trade is based upon the notion that different countries produce different products in different ways, and that the consumers of the world, in effect, should have the choice of buying from where they wish at the best possible prices. So from an economics point of view, from the point of view of comparative advantage, it doesn't make any sense to try to use trade restrictions to intervene in what is really the very essence of international trade, that is comparative advantage.
Mexico had its decision, but trying to enforce it might jeopardize its trade relations with its biggest trading partner, the U.S. But in a little noticed part of the decision, the GATT panel suggested a possible compromise.
They pointed to the possibility for a preferable solution to be reached through international cooperation from the United States and Mexico, reaching an agreement that doesn't involve trade restrictions and that leads to the reduction and, one would hope, the elimination of dolphin mortality in the process of tuna fishing.
GATT's suggestion led to a La Jolla, California hotel where the U.S. met with Mexico and other tuna fishing nations. They reached the La Jolla Agreement, an agreement to reduce dolphin deaths by improving tuna finding technology and increasing monitoring on tuna boats. The La Jolla Agreement didn't end the practice of setting nets on dolphins. So, with the Marine Mammal Protection Act still in force, the U.S. embargo on Mexican tuna stayed in place. But the La Jolla Agreement did result in a tuna industry a little safer for dolphins and a little safer for free trade. Not a total victory for either side, but the kind of gradual, incremental change that trade negotiations can produce.
So is there a contradiction between free trade and environmental protection? Some time ago, I was joined by some of my economics colleagues in Melbourne, Australia, to discuss this case study. They include Richard Snape of Monash University in Australia, Hervé Torres of the International Monetary Fund, and Magnus Blomström of the Stockholm School of Economics. Let's see how the discussion went.
Richard, when does a country have a right to impose environmental standards on another country?
That's a very contentious question. Countries are of course, very jealous of their national sovereignty, and it's always a very mute question as to when does the offence which one country caused to another, one way or another, warrant some retaliation from that country. In these cases, we're talking about damage to the environment or to a species in general. And when does one country have a right to enforce its standards on another is something which is very much in dispute in the world. The Malaysians, for example, are very cross with a number of developed countries which are trying to tell them that they shouldn't cut down and export tropical timber. The Malaysians say that's a resource which is available to them. It's part of their development that they should be able to use that resource. It's not yet, they would argue, in danger of extinction. Other countries have used timber in their countries as part of their development. In Britain, they've cut down nearly all the forests that used to exist centuries ago. Why should the Malaysians be denied the opportunity to develop using that resource?
Is it a question here where you've got richer, more developed countries imposing their views on those countries that are trying to develop and are actually a lot poorer?
Well, it is, in a way. The concern about the environment is highly related to the stage of development of a country or of a nation. The environment is a kind of superior good, which means that it's something that people want more as they get richer or wealthier. In the United States or any other developed country, there was not so much concern as there is today about the environment when they were not so rich or they were not so wealthy. Developing nation has sometimes or many times some other priorities. They have important problems like starvation or people without any kind of employment, and those are their priorities. The environment is an extremely important thing, but it has to be recognized that in order to be concerned about the environment, those countries have to first develop their economy. So the best way in which a developed country may help or other countries to be concerned about the environment is trying to, through trade basically, allow those other countries to develop.
We can't just dismiss environmental concerns, though.
Well, you're right about that, except that this particular case study lays out the sort of tension very nicely, because on the one hand, you've got environmentalists concerned about the dolphins, which, by the way, are not an extinct or endangered, in any sense, species. But on the other hand, you do have the livelihood of the Mexican fishermen. And the question is, you know, from both in terms of a Mexican set of priorities, but also more broadly speaking, in terms of the ability of Mexico to develop, to generate jobs and so forth. Do we have the right to impose these kinds of things, which have very dramatic and noticeable effects on their levels of well-being?
Does it have to be exclusive to trade, environmental protection? Does it necessarily have to damage trade?
Well, I think the problem there is that if a country thinks that something is extremely important, what instruments does it have available? And of course, a trade instrument is one of the available and one of the very few instruments which are available in order to influence the other country's policy. But then, of course, we have the problem that using trade barriers for that point and for that sort of purpose means that it can be misused, that other people who, with trade barriers being put on to protect the environment, people who want to be protected in their industries for quite other reasons can use that instrument as a means to get protection for them and to misuse that instrument.
And then it could become a tit for tat. The one country does it, the other one responds, and the circle just goes round and round.
But it's also a bit of a Pandora's box. Once you open up that door, then you leave open the possibility that countries can object to any aspect of the production of a particular good, and that's very dangerous.
I think that the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade has drawn a nice line on this one and said that you can't differentiate amongst products according to how they're produced, and this came out in the case study, according to how they're produced, with one exception, that is prison labor. If prison labor is used, then you can discriminate against that. But otherwise, you don't look at how goods are produced, you simply look at the final product. And you can discriminate between apples and oranges, but you can't discriminate, for example, on a fine division between different types of coffee as to whether they were produced in one country or by one bean or in another country by another bean.
Richard, thank you.
The case study that we saw illustrates the tension on the one hand between trying to save the dolphins and on the other hand 25,000 Mexican fishing jobs. But this brings us to a very complex issue relating to trade, environment, and development. And let's see if we can take this in steps and look at a number of key questions and try to answer them. The first is, are developing countries more or less concerned about pollution, and do they pollute more or less than developed or industrial countries? To answer that question, let's look at a series of graphs that show us the level of pollution as countries move up the development scale. This was a study done by the World Bank that looked at a cross-section of countries, and it looks at various types of pollution across these countries. So you see that certain kinds of pollution actually decline as economies move up the development scale, as they become more developed, as it were. One of these is safe water. As economies grow, become more developed, as they become richer, they reduce the level of unsafe water. They develop better means of cleaning up water for drinking and so forth. So population without safe water declines as we increase development, as we get richer. Similarly, with urban population without adequate sanitation, without adequate sewage, as a country becomes richer, as it grows, as it moves up the development scale, things like open sewers and streets are removed, are cleaned up, are put underground in pipes and so forth. So sanitation gets improved as we move up the development ladder. There are other kinds of pollution, however, that increase initially as a country becomes wealthier or richer, but then eventually decline. One of these is particulate matter in the air, largely from burning garbage or burning wood and so forth. So that tends to increase initially as a country becomes richer and wealthier, as its people become wealthier, but then declines fairly dramatically as governments put in place policies to clean up the air. Another example of this is sulfur dioxide, where, in fact, again, as a country begins to develop, sulfur dioxide emissions tend to rise, but eventually, as their governments put in place policies and so forth to clean up the environment, the sulfur dioxide emissions will decline. Deforestation is another example of this. This is a kind of pollution, environmental problem that has received a lot of attention. And notice here again that what happens is in the initial phases of development, deforestation is a serious problem, let's say in countries like Brazil and so forth. But as that economy gets richer, as it becomes more developed, then they put in place forestry programs, as it were, in whether it's Canada, US, or Europe, and deforestation becomes a far less serious problem. There are other kinds of pollution that tend to increase as the economies become very industrialized or very developed, and certainly municipal waste per capita is one of these. Basically trash. Often what we do is, as we become more developed, we tend to buy more disposable kinds of products, so that adds to the trash. We consume a lot more, we dispose of a lot more. So typically, as countries become more developed, as people become richer, municipal trash becomes a more serious problem. Similarly, auto transmissions, carbon dioxide emissions per capita, are in fact worse as a country moves up the development scale. Basically, this has to do with more cars. People become richer, they buy more cars, and so that creates a problem in terms of auto emissions. Now, incidentally, it's important to point out that many countries are now beginning to put in place auto emission standards, the US being a good example, so hopefully that curve will begin to dip back down again. There is an interesting corollary here, and that is that as countries move up the development scale, they tend to use more and more energy, and that can create a problem in terms of polluting because you're burning fossil fuels of various kinds, like especially coal and oil, that tend to pollute a lot. And you can see here that China and India have seen huge increases in their energy consumption, and that obviously has added to the pollution problem in those countries. Now, this is a source of discussion between these countries and the industrial countries, and many of the industrial countries are looking to export pollution control technologies to China and India, and there's some pressure being put on China to reduce its use of dirty fuels like coal and increase its use of cleaner fuels like natural gas. Now, this brings us to our second question about trade and the environment, which is there something inherently harmful about trade and growth on the one hand and environmental protection on the other hand? The idea here is trade obviously fosters and encourages growth, and then is growth in and of itself harmful to the environment? And the answer is no, not necessarily. If you look at this, this is an attempt, it's a schematic here, to show that there are ways of delinking GDP growth, or gross domestic product growth, which is the growth in the economy, and pollution. And if countries are effective in putting into place pollution abatement kinds of programs, they can in fact keep growing while they're reducing the levels of pollution. And we can see this in practice for the OECD countries, the industrial countries of the world here, from 1970 to 1988, where GDP continued to grow. That's the blue line at the top. But many types of pollution were either held steady or declined. For example, lead pollution declined by some 85%. Particulates were more like 65%. sulfur dioxide closer to about 40%. Nitrogen oxides, not as great a success here, but at least they didn't increase. But the point is that growth was delinked from pollution. And so there's nothing inherently harmful about growth to the environment, provided, obviously, that the right kind of policies are put in place to control pollution while the economy is growing. Let's take the bull by the horns and tackle the question, are free trade and environmental protection incompatible goals? Most economists would answer the question, no. Let's see if we can elaborate. First of all, trade results in less wasteful use of resources. Trade provides for the most efficient allocation of resources within a country and across countries. If you try to limit trade through protectionist measures, that creates more waste. And the notion here is that less waste leads to less pollution. The second is that trade results in greater prosperity and increased demands for a cleaner environment. The idea here, again, is that as people become wealthier, as they move up the development scale, then they demand and ask for greater environmental protection. In other words, they become more aware of environmental issues and demand their governments to put in place more environmental protection. Finally, there are different environmental standards at different stages of development. As we saw earlier, in developing countries, especially at the early stages, they have different problems, they have different challenges before them environmentally, whereas those are entirely different from a country, let's say, like the US, that tends to worry more about things like air pollution in terms of auto emissions. So to try to impose our standards, let's say, on those of Bangladesh would be not only unfair, but inappropriate in the sense that their needs and their environmental problems are very different than ours. So in that sense, it's a very different set of issues. And so therefore, our standards are not very useful and appropriate for them. Now let's tackle another tough question that often comes up in terms of the environment. And the issue here is that, do different environmental standards affect competitiveness? A number of people have worried that because environmental protection is less and the costs and the payments for environmental protection are less in developing countries, that somehow they have a competitive edge. Their costs are lower, therefore they can compete, in effect, unfairly with us, but compete aggressively against some of our products that have built into them the price of environmental protection and environmental cleanup. The reality is that environmental costs only account for 0.5% to 1% of GDP. Even in the most polluting industries, environmental costs only account for about 3% of total output. So this suggests that even if there are large differences between environmental costs across countries, they will have a very small impact on international goods prices and therefore a very small impact on competitiveness. Now, where does all this leave us in terms of trade policy and the environment? And let's look at a couple of key issues here. Should trade policies be used to influence environmental standards in other countries? And so far, the conclusion we've come to is no, for a variety of reasons. One is that free trade, in fact, enhances environmental awareness and often leads to an improvement in the environment in many developing countries. But the other is, as we mentioned earlier, that different countries at different stages of development have different environmental needs and different standards. So it's inappropriate to impose our standards or industrial country standards on developing country standards. Second, should trade policies be used to enforce and implement international environmental agreements? There have been a number of these over the years relating to hazardous waste or acid rain and so forth. But again, it's important not to link in trade and environmental policies. Again, largely because trade policies can be very blunt instruments. They can create a lot of uncertainty. But also, they're not that closely linked. So it's, again, it's using the wrong tools for the right policies, in effect. So what is the right way to approach both trade and environmental issues? Well, certainly, to begin with, to ensure open trade and investment. That, as we've indicated so far, works in the direction of helping environmental issues and environmental protection. Second, clearly invest in technological development in those key areas of environmental protection and cleaner environment. Third, pay for environmental services. And specifically here what we're saying is if biodiversity is important to the industrial world, if maintaining and saving the rainforest is important to industrialized countries, then we ought to pay for part of the share of keeping those. It shouldn't, the burden should not all fall on the developing nations, on the poor nations. Fourth, we need to refocus our aid goals to have more of an environmental goal and more of an environmental focus, if that's important, which it is. And finally, encourage development. As we saw earlier, as countries become more developed, they become more aware of environmental problems, and they enact more policies to reduce pollution. So encouraging development is very much a good policy in terms of trying to clean up the global environment. So far, we've looked at various policies as they relate to environment and environmental problems within a country. But what if pollution spills over into another country, across national borders? What happens then? To begin to discuss this issue, we'll look at our next case study that looks at pollution along the Rhine.
High in the Swiss Alps, the source of the Rhine, 1,300 kilometers long, the Rhine is one of the longest rivers in Europe, running through Switzerland, France, Germany and Holland to its North Sea exit. The river is an important shipping connection between the various countries. Fishing in the Rhine has gone on for centuries. In historic Dordrecht, stone facades commemorate the prosperous salmon fishing industry, but the salmon have disappeared. After World War II, industrial activity thrived along the Rhine. Economic growth was more important than care for the environment. Dumping waste into the river was regarded as normal. In the 70s, researchers diagnosed the situation as critical.
To give an example, the percentage of oxygen in the Rhine during the 70s was at times as low as 1 milligram per litre. At that point, the river is essentially dead. Fish can't live there as they need oxygen to survive.
The measurement ship ascertains that the water passing the border from Germany into Holland carries with it 350 kilos of salt per second, 50,000 tons of salt each day. At least a third of this salt comes from the French potassium mines, which have expelled waste into the Rhine since 1932. In Western Europe, around 20 million people depend on the Rhine for drinking water. Not only is the salt in the water a health hazard, but it also incurs other costs, according to the director of Amsterdam's waterworks.
Ja, voor Amsterdam hebben we die kosten vrij exact kunnen becijferen.
Yes, for Amsterdam, we've been able to estimate the costs at around $1 million a year for extra cleaning, extra pipe scouring, cement linings in cast iron pipes to prevent rusting, premature replacement of pipes.
Het vroegtijdig vervangen van buizen.
The greenhouse horticultural industry in Western Holland has had years of trouble from the salt building in the surface water. A grower.
Because
of the ever-increasing salt content of the Rhine, the development and growth of plants has suffered, resulting in lower production and diminishing quality.
The pollution of Europe is a danger against which no one land alone can fight, the Council of Europe determined in 1970. Prince Philip made a fiery plea for cleaner rivers.
We need to decide whether we want to use our rivers and lakes as a supply of domestic water, or for sport and recreation, or as carriers of recycled industrial water, or to let them rot as sewers. They cannot be used for all these purposes at once.
But French potassium mines continued dumping salt waste into the Rhine. In 1974, 3 Dutch growers brought a lawsuit against the potassium mines. But the pollution came from outside the borders.
We hebben met onze advocaten gekeken hoe wij dit zouden kunnen oplossen en we kregen het advies.
Our lawyers advise us to ask the judge in Rotterdam whether a Dutch judge had jurisdiction over cross-border environmental disputes. The judge said, no, we don't have that authority. So we went to our higher court in The Hague. The judge there referred us to a court in Luxembourg where they said, yes, the Dutch courts have authority to judge cross-border environment disputes.
De Nederlandse rechtspraak is bevoegd grensoverschrijdende milieuverontreinigingen te veroordelen.
After 14 years of legal proceedings by the growers, the Rotterdam court finally made a pronouncement.
De uitspraak was na die 14 jaar dat de vervuiler...
The pronouncement held the foreign polluter responsible for damage done to Dutch horticulture.
Zijn vervuiling, oftewel de schade, is toegericht aan de Nederlandse tuinbouw.
In 1976, the ministers of the countries bordering the Rhine signed the Rhine Salt Treaty. But it wasn't until 1987 that France agreed to a partial storage of the salt. Neelie Kroes was at that time a Dutch minister and negotiator for Holland.
In internationale onderhandelingen valt wel meer op.
In international negotiations, it seems as if you need immortality to see a decision reached. But the ones with stamina win, and this was also true here. Of course, in most cases, the polluter tries to get away from paying the costs of cleaning up the mess that comes from his production process. They say, if you want it, you can pay for it. But it is outrageous that those who suffer should have to foot the bill. It should be stopped at source.
Degene die er last heeft, de rekening zou moeten betalen. Het moet ophouden bij de bron.
But who had to bear the cost for stopping the waste dumping?
Frankrijk en Duitsland nemen 30% van hun rekening.
France and Germany took care of 30%. We took 34% and Switzerland 6%.
But wouldn't it have been more appropriate for the polluter to pay?
Ja, we hebben toen gekeken voor deze verdeling van de kosten.
Yes. In order to determine how to share the costs at that time, we looked at who suffered most and where the pollution came from, of course. And yet, we had to continuously remind ourselves that the division had to be feasible. That's how we came up with this solution.
Dus dit is eruit gekomen.
The polluter pays something, of course, and the French potassium mines have now begun to stem the dumping of salt waste. But the costs were spread over the various countries that had interest in higher quality Rhine water. Thus, the polluter pays only a small share. The concerned parties pay, in practice, the largest part.
Rhine water quality has measurably improved since the 70s. Cities and industrial concerns now command large-scale wastewater purification processes. But will the salmon ever return to the Rhine?
Zeker geloof ik erin. Het is op dit moment zelfs zo dat we zeggen, ja, de kwaliteit...
I believe that the salmon will be back. The quality of the water is such, it is currently capable of supporting the salmon. But the issue is whether we could actually get the salmon back in quantities required for them to be able to propagate themselves, that they could reach their spawning grounds. The salmon could thrive here, but we'll be working for years before we reach that stage again.
...bezig zijn om inderdaad dat stadium weer te bereiken.
Meanwhile, at various places along the river basin, stocking of young salmon continues. Perhaps the salmon will one day return to stay as permanent inhabitants of the Rhine.
So what is the best way of dealing with pollution along the Rhine? Let's rejoin our panel in Australia and see what they have to say.
Richard, can we see a situation where common property resources can be protected from overuse?
Yes, common property resources are always a problem within countries as well as between countries. I will look after my backyard very well. I may not be quite so respectful about the backyard of the person next to me, but if I'm not respecting it, he'll take action against me. But I may not be so respectful even more of the park or the land which belongs to everyone. And then it's a problem of who will in fact get back at me, who will take action against me to look after it, or what incentive do I have to look after the park when everyone else may be messing it up because they have no incentive to look after it. Now this is a common area of problem in the environment and so on, and it applies within countries and it applies between countries, not only the common property within a country, the common property the common environment that the world has as a whole. And the problem is, how do we establish property rights? Because when there are property rights established, then people will try to enforce those rights, just as my neighbour will enforce his right if I start throwing my rubbish over his fence.
Well, given the situation that we saw along the Rhine, why was it that governments didn't take a more coordinated approach to stopping this overuse?
Well, in fact, they did, and that's the way they resolved the issue eventually, was that it exactly required them all to get together and come to an agreement about how they're going to work this out. Otherwise, they might not have been able to really resolve the issue, but that's what it took.
But that was most likely a result of the existence of the EC, because without the European community, it would probably have been impossible to do it, at least in some
And they'd let
fashion.
it go on for years and years before addressing it.
Oh, no, definitely, definitely.
In order to coordinate policies of that kind, of regulation of that kind, you need strong institutions. The problem of common properties being polluted exists all over the world. For example, we have problems with our neighbors, rivers that go across both countries and are being polluted both sides. But then you need strong governments and strong institutions. You need to impose property rights, to enforce these rights. And again, it is related to development, to the stage of development of countries or nations.
So then we have the problem in this. Within a country, of course, a government can assign property rights and it can insist on in various forms of environmental or other regulation. But who does it when things cross boundaries? Within the European community, there was an institutional framework in which that could be arranged. But as between other countries where you don't have the same institutional framework, how do you solve it? And it really becomes the same sort of case as me and my neighbour, with me throwing the rubbish over his fence. Now, because of the legal institution within the country, he could take legal action against me. But how between countries?
Should the environment be exclusive to trade, or can they be compatible?
There's no reason why international trade cannot, in fact, help the environment, and we can think in some very good examples of that. In many cases, protection, stopping trade, in fact, results in dirty processes continuing. For example, in Europe, the protection of the coal industry protects, in fact, the use of dirty coal. And it's the same in the United States.
And the car industry, not to mention it.
Yes. And if, in fact, the Europeans were, and the Americans reduced the import barriers to coal, they would, in fact, use clean Australian coal, which would, in fact, make the world environment better off. But
and
instead
the Australians
of
happier.
And the Australians happier, which is, of course, a very good thing.
Very important point.
So in that case, it's very clear that going for more open trade would, in fact, be not only more efficient, but also would, in fact, produce a cleaner environment.
In fact, there is a growing industry for the protection of the environment, which is creating jobs too, which is generating new investment. And the good thing to do would be to promote global economic growth so that all those countries that are now polluting the environment can also use these products.
Can afford importing them.
And import them. Yeah. And in this way, we will have the benefit of another growing industry.
Let's see if we can summarize the case study and the discussion and focus on the elements of a successful transnational environmental policy. Obviously, the first ingredient is international agreements, in the sense that we saw in the case study that the European countries got together and agreed on what the appropriate policies were to reduce the pollution along the Rhine. A second ingredient is the assignment of property rights. If certain countries or towns or even companies could be given the property rights to certain sections of the Rhine River, they could then charge for the pollution or the cleanup of the river along that. And that would lead to a more optimal allocation of resources and more optimal and reduced levels of pollution. What is the bottom line in terms of trade and the environment? Two conclusions. The first is that free trade and environmental protection are not contradictory goals. The second is that the need for international agreements and cooperation on environmental policies will be increasing as environmental problems are becoming more global, these kinds of agreements and cooperation become critical. For Inside the Global Economy, this is Annenberg.
Annenberg Media. For information about this and other Annenberg Media programs, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org.